January wind scraped ice off the church stepstones, each gust carrying the smell of wet wool and horse sweat from the hitching posts below. Ruth Calloway climbed toward Silas Drummond's ranch porch, her threadbare shawl dusted white, fingers already numb inside worn gloves. Townsfolk clustered in the yard, breath fog hanging like ghosts, boots crunching frozen mud. Drummond stood framed in his doorway, thumbs hooked in his vest. "Can you mend?" he asked, voice flat. Ruth nodded once. He disappeared inside, returned dragging a shredded cavalry saddle, leather torn in 4 places, stirrup half severed, threw it at her feet, thud against stone. 15 minutes, he said. Don't speak. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ruth knelt in the mud, pulled a needle from her coat pocket, and began threading waxed sinew. Her cross-hitch pattern emerged tight and deliberate, impossible to fake. Drummond's pocket watch ticked. When she finished, he inspected the saddle without a word, turned, walked inside. The foreman muttered, "Boss don't hire widows," but Drummond reappeared, tossed a coin purse. Mondays, shed out back. The workshop shed squatted behind Drummond's main barn like something ashamed of itself. Ruth pushed the door open, hinges screaming rust, and stepped into air so cold it burned her lungs. No fire in the stove. The chimney pipe hung crooked, half detached. Tools lay scattered across a warped workbench, their metal dulled with neglect and winter damp. A pile of saddles slumped in the corner, leather stiff as corpses. She set down her satchel, tested the stove door. It swung loose on one hinge. Footsteps crunched behind her. Cal, Drummond's foreman, filled the doorway. He wore a coat lined with sheep's wool, hat pulled low. His breath smelled of tobacco and morning whiskey. "Boss wants 12 saddles mended by Friday," he said. Dropped an iron key on the bench. "Lock up when you leave. Don't touch nothing but leather." Ruth counted the saddles. 14, maybe 15. All torn, buckles broken, stitching rotted through. "That's 4 days," she said quietly. Cal shrugged. "Then you best not sleep." He turned to go. "Is there firewood?" Ruth asked. He paused in the doorway, didn't look back. "Earn it first." The door slammed. The sound echoed in the cold shed like a lid closing over a coffin. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter and picked up the first saddle. Her fingers were already stiffening. She flexed them, blew warm breath across her knuckles, and reached for her needle. Outside, the wind howled through gaps in the shed walls. Inside, Ruth Calloway began to stitch. 3 hours later, Doc Moss appeared in the doorway with a tin cup of coffee steaming in his gloved hands. He was a tall man, 61, with a gray beard that never quite looked tamed, and eyes sharp enough to count lies at 20 paces. "Gracie told me you were out here," he said, stepping inside. Set the cup on the bench. "Thought you might freeze before sundown." Ruth wrapped both hands around the cup. The heat bit into her palms, painful and perfect. She drank slow, feeling warmth spread down her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. Doc glanced around the shed, frowned at the broken stove, the lack of light, the saddles piled like accusations. "Drummond's got you working in this?" "It's work," Ruth said. Doc pulled a crate over and sat, his knees cracked. He studied her face for a long moment, then pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Ruth," he said slowly, "I need to tell you something." She set the cup down. Her stomach tightened. "Drummond filed a claim on your grazing land," Doc said. 10 days ago, at the Territorial Land Office in Helena." The shed seemed to tilt. Ruth gripped the edge of the bench. "That's my husband's land," she said. "Ben filed the permit in 72, before we even married." Doc nodded. "I know, but the registry says otherwise. Says Drummond filed first claim in 71, got the surveyor's stamp and everything." Ruth's mouth went dry. "That's a lie." "I believe you," Doc said. "But lies with stamps on them got a way of standing up in court." He unfolded the paper. It was a notice. Official territorial seal at the top, dense legal script below. Ruth couldn't read most of it. The words blurred together like insects crawling across the page. But she saw the date, March 15th, 1876, 60 days from filing to finalize the claim. 60 days, she said aloud. Doc nodded. "Unless you can prove Ben filed first. Original permit, surveyor's notes, something with his name and a date." Ruth thought of the trunk back in her cabin. Ben's things, his worn coat, his Sunday hat, the saddlebag with his initials carved inside, but no papers. She'd looked 100 times after he died, nothing but letters from his brother and a faded map of the valley. "I don't have anything," she said. Doc folded the notice and handed it to her. His face was grim. Then you got 60 days to find it, or Drummond owns everything Ben worked for. He stood, touched her shoulder briefly, and walked toward the door. Doc, Ruth called. He turned. Why would he do this? She asked. The land's barely worth grazing 12 head. Doc's jaw tightened. Railroad's coming through next year. Surveyor's been out here since fall. Your land sits right where they'll want to lay track. He paused. Drummond ain't just stealing dirt, Ruth. He's stealing your future. The wind gusted, rattling the shed walls. Doc pulled his hat low and stepped into the cold. Ruth sat alone, staring at the notice in her hands. Outside, the first snow of February began to fall. Sunday morning came dressed in gray. Ruth walked the half-mile from her cabin to the whitewashed church at the edge of town, boots sinking into snow that had refrozen overnight into a crust sharp enough to cut through wool socks. The church bell rang, 3 slow tolls that echoed across the valley. Families clustered on the steps, women in their best shawls, men scraping mud from their boots before entering. Children chased each other between the wagons, their laughter bright and careless. Ruth climbed the steps alone. As she reached the landing, the conversations died. Not all at once, just a slow draining of sound, like water leaking from a cracked barrel. Faces turned toward her, then away. Women adjusted their bonnets. Men suddenly found interest in the grain of the wooden rail. Ruth kept her chin level and walked toward the door. "Morning, Mrs. Calloway," someone murmured, a voice too low to place. No one else spoke. Inside, the church smelled of old hymnals and beeswax candles. Ruth slipped into the back pew, the one reserved for widows and unmarried women. The wood was cold beneath her. The pew in front of her, the one where she'd sat with Ben for 3 years, remained empty. No one moved to fill it. Pastor Webb entered through the side door, his black coat freshly brushed, his face soft and round as risen dough. He climbed the pulpit steps and spread his hands wide. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather in gratitude this Lord's Day." Ruth folded her hands in her lap and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Only the cold and the silence pressing in from all sides. Pastor Webb's voice swelled. "And we give thanks for the generosity of our brothers who provide for this house of worship. This week, Brother Drummond donated a new bell rope, 30 feet of the finest hemp, brought all the way from St. Louis." A murmur of approval rippled through the congregation. "A man of true Christian charity," Pastor Webb continued, smiling toward the front pews where Drummond sat, arms crossed, face unreadable. Ruth's jaw tightened. She stared at the back of Drummond's head, the oiled hair, the expensive collar, the way he sat like a man who owned not just land but souls. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. After the service, she left quickly, not waiting for the fellowship hour. As she descended the church steps, she heard it, whispered but not whispered enough. Charity case. Heard she's working for Drummond now, in that freezing shed. What choice does she have? No sons, no family, just her and that land she can't prove is hers. Ruth walked faster. Her breath came short and sharp. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she didn't feel it. Behind her, the church door opened and closed. Boots on stone. She didn't turn around. Sheriff Tate caught up to her halfway down the road. He was a stocky man with a graying mustache and eyes that never quite met yours straight on. "Mrs. Calloway," he called. "Need a word." Ruth stopped, turned slowly. The sheriff held a folded paper in his gloved hand. He didn't look happy about it. "Got a delivery for you," he said. Held out the paper. Ruth took it. Her fingers shook, not from cold. "What is this?" "Eviction notice," Sheriff Tate said quietly. "Territorial court. Drummond's filing says you're occupying land without legal claim. Gives you 30 days to vacate or prove ownership." The world seemed to narrow. Ruth stared at the paper. More official seals, more dense script she couldn't fully parse. But the numbers were clear enough. 30 days. "This is my land," she said, voice thin as wire. "My husband's land." "Registry says different," the sheriff replied. He shifted his weight, glanced back toward the church. "Look, I don't like this any more than you do. But Drummond's got the documentation. Original permit dated 1871, surveyor's mark, witness signatures, mates." "It's forged," Ruth said. Sheriff Tate winced. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "It's the truth." "Then you'll need to prove it." He touched the brim of his hat. 30 days, Mrs. Calloway. I'm sorry." He walked back toward town, boots crunching in the frozen snow. Ruth stood alone on the road, paper trembling in her hands. A wagon rolled past. Drummond's, driven by Cal the foreman. It slowed as it drew level with her. Drummond leaned out the window. His face was calm, almost pleasant, the face of a man who'd already won. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "heard the sheriff found you." Ruth said nothing. Drummond smiled, thin and cold as January ice. "Difficult news, I'm sure, but I'm not an unreasonable man." He paused. "You can stay in the shed, long as you keep working. $3 a week, minus room and board, of course." Ruth's throat tightened. "Room and board?" "The shed's got a roof," Drummond said, "and I'll see you get firewood. Meals from the ranch kitchen. That's worth something, wouldn't you say?" He didn't wait for an answer. 12 saddles by Friday, he said. "Don't be late." The wagon rolled on, leaving Ruth standing in the frozen ruts. She looked down at the eviction notice, at the shed key still in her coat pocket, at the 30 days written in ink that wouldn't smudge. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke and horses and something else, something sharp and bitter she couldn't name. Behind her, the church bell rang once, a single, flat note. No one was speaking the truth today. Doc Moss showed up at the shed on Tuesday with a leather satchel under one arm and a look on his face that said he'd been chewing on something bitter for days. Ruth was elbow-deep in saddle number 7, her fingers raw from pulling thread through stiff winter leather. The stove, now grudgingly functional after she'd wedged the chimney pipe back into place, threw weak heat into the corners of the shed. "You eaten today?" Doc asked, setting a wrapped bundle on the bench. Ruth glanced at it, bread and cheese, by the smell. "Not yet," she admitted. "Then stop and eat." He pulled the crate over and sat heavily. His knees popped like kindling catching fire. Can't mend leather if your hands are shaking. Ruth unwrapped the bundle and ate slowly. The bread was still warm. It tasted like forgiveness. Doc reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded document, the same eviction notice the sheriff had delivered, but this one had notes scrawled in the margins in Doc's tight handwriting. "I went to Helena yesterday," he said. "Looked at the territorial registry myself." Ruth's chewing slowed. She swallowed hard. "And?" Doc spread the paper on the bench, smoothing it with one weathered hand. His finger traced a line near the bottom, Drummond's signature, bold and confident. "This here's the permit Drummond filed," Doc said. "Dated March 1871. Got the surveyor's stamp, witness signatures, the works." Ruth set down the bread. Her appetite vanished. "But there's something off," Doc continued. He pulled a small magnifying lens from his pocket, the kind he used for examining livestock wounds, and held it over the signature. "Look at the ink." Ruth leaned closer. Under the lens, the ink looked darker than she expected, almost purple in the light. "What am I seeing?" she asked. "That's aniline ink," Doc said, "the kind that came into use after the war. But here's the thing, there was a shortage in '72. Whole Western territories couldn't get it for near a year. Anyone filing documents in '71 or early '72 would have used iron gall ink that's brownish, fades with time." He tapped the paper. "This ink? Still purple, still bright. That means it was put down recently, last year maybe, not 1871. Ruth's heart kicked against her ribs. "So it's forged." "Likely," Doc said carefully. "But proving it's another matter. Drummond's got friends in Helena, clerk at the land office owes him money, and without Ben's original filing..." He trailed off. Ruth stared at the paper. Her husband's name was nowhere on it, as if he'd never existed, as if 3 years of breaking ground and stringing fence and sleeping under stars had been nothing but smoke. "I don't have Ben's permit," she said quietly. "I've looked everywhere." Doc folded the paper and tucked it back into his satchel. "Then we need something else. Physical proof Drummond's lying, something he can't forge or buy his way around." The shed door creaked open. Cold air rushed in. Gracie stood in the doorway, her dark hair escaping from beneath a knit cap, her small face solemn. She held a tin pail covered with cloth. "Gracie girl," Doc said, softening. "What do you got there?" The child didn't answer, she never did, just crossed to the bench and set the pail down gently, lifted the cloth. Inside, stew, still steaming, with chunks of carrot and potato floating in rich broth. The smell hit Ruth like a memory. Sunday dinners, Ben laughing, the cabin warm and full. "Your grandmother send that?" Doc asked. Gracie nodded. Ruth's throat tightened. "Tell her thank you," she whispered. Gracie's eyes, wide and dark as creek water, fixed on Ruth's face. Then she turned, slow as a doe testing the wind, and walked to the corner where Ruth's husband's old saddlebag hung on a peg. She reached up, touched the leather. Her small fingers traced the brand burned into the flap, a circled R with a slash through it. Ben's mark. Then her hand jerked back. She stumbled away from the bag like she'd been stung. Doc was on his feet. "Gracie, what's wrong, honey?" The girl's face had gone pale. She shook her head, sharp, frantic, and bolted for the door. "Gracie," Doc called. But she was gone, footsteps fading into the snow. Doc found Gracie an hour later, sitting on the porch steps of his clinic, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't look up when he sat beside her. "You want to tell me what scared you?" he asked gently. She shook her head. Doc sighed. He'd been trying to coax words out of his granddaughter for 8 months, ever since her mother died of fever and Gracie's voice disappeared like it had been buried with her. Some days he thought he saw the words forming on her lips. Other days, nothing but silence. "Was it the saddlebag?" he tried. Gracie's shoulders stiffened. "Something about the brand?" She turned her face away, but not before Doc saw it. The flinch, the flicker of recognition and fear. He sat with that for a moment, thinking, turning pieces over in his mind the way he did when a sick animal wouldn't tell him where it hurt. "You've seen that brand before," he said softly. "Haven't you?" Gracie pulled her knees tighter. Doc reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook and pencil, set them on the step between them. "You don't have to talk," he said. "But maybe you could draw it for me, the brand you saw." For a long time, Gracie didn't move. Then slowly she picked up the pencil, drew a circle, a slash through it, just like Ben's mark. Then beneath it, she drew another symbol, larger, bolder, a circled D with horns curving up from the top, Drummond's cattle brand. Doc stared at the drawing, his pulse quickened. "Gracie," he said carefully, "where did you see these brands together?" The girl's hand was shaking now. She pointed east, toward Drummond's ranch. Then she dropped the pencil and ran inside. Doc sat alone on the porch steps, the notebook open in his hands, the wind carrying the smell of distant livestock and cold earth. Somewhere, a piece of truth was hiding, and an 8-year-old girl knew where it was buried. Ruth was banking the stove for the night. 9th saddle finished, 3 more to go, when she heard boots on gravel and a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years. "Well, hell, so this is where you ended up." She turned slowly. Lyle Calloway stood in the doorway, backlit by the last thin light of a February dusk. He was Ben's younger brother, same broad shoulders, same dark hair. But where Ben had been steady as oak, Lyle was all restless edge. His coat hung open despite the cold. His breath smelled of whiskey even from 10 feet away. "Lyle," Ruth said quietly. He stepped inside, glanced around the shed with a look that said he'd expected worse, and found it. Cozy. Ruth set down the poker. "What are you doing here?" "Came to check on family." He picked up one of the finished saddles, turned it over in his hands. "Heard you were working for Drummond now. That true?" "It's work," Ruth said. Lyle laughed, short and bitter. "Work, that's one word for it." He dropped the saddle back on the pile. "You know what the boys in town are saying? That you're Drummond's charity case, his pet project, poor widow with no sense and no land." Ruth's jaw tightened. "I have land. Ben's land." "Ben's dead," Lyle said flatly. "And dead men don't hold deeds." The words hit like a fist. Ruth turned away, busied her hands with organizing tools that didn't need organizing. Lyle moved closer. She could smell the whiskey now, sharp and sour. "Look, I didn't come here to fight. I came to help." "Help how?" He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, set it on the workbench. "Drummond made me an offer, $200 for Ben's claim, cash, today." Ruth stared at the paper. "That land's worth 10 times that." "Maybe, if you could prove you own it." Lyle tapped the paper. "But you can't, so it's worth nothing, unless you sell now, while Drummond's still being generous." "Generous," Ruth repeated, voice flat. "He don't have to offer you anything," Lyle said. 30 days from now, he'll take it anyway. You'll walk away with nothing but frozen fingers and a broke-down shed." He paused. "Take the 200. Split it with me. 100 each. You can start over someplace warm, someplace that ain't trying to kill you." Ruth picked up the paper, read it slowly, her lips moving over the words. Transfer of claim, consideration of $200, relinquishment of all rights. "You already signed it," she said softly, pointing to Lyle's signature at the bottom. "Just needs yours," Lyle said. "Then we're done. Free." Ruth set the paper down. Looked at her brother-in-law. Really looked. Saw the desperation behind the swagger, the way his hands trembled slightly, the stain on his shirt collar that spoke of too many nights in too many saloons. "How much do you owe him?" she asked. Lyle's face hardened. "That ain't your concern?" "How much?" He turned away, ran a hand through his hair. $60. Poker debt. "But that ain't why." "Get out," Ruth said. Lyle spun back. "You think you're going to win this? You think some judge is going to side with you over Drummond? He's got the law, Ruth. He's got the money. He's got every damn thing except your name on a piece of paper." His voice rose. "And you ain't got nothing." "I've got Ben's memory," Ruth said quietly. "And I won't sell it for $100 and your poker debt." Lyle stared at her for a long moment. Then he snatched the unsigned paper off the bench and shoved it back in his coat. "You're a fool," he said, just like Ben was. He walked out into the gathering dark. Ruth stood alone in the shed, the stove ticking as it cooled, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the bench to steady them. Outside, a horse whinnied. Hooves faded into distance. The smell of whiskey lingered. Friday came cold and clear. Ruth delivered all 12 saddles to the ranch house at dawn, her arms aching from the weight. Cal inspected each one in silence, then nodded once and walked away. No payment, no thanks. Ruth waited on the porch for 10 minutes before Drummond appeared, coffee cup in hand, looking rested and prosperous. "Good work," he said mildly. "You've earned your keep." "My wages," Ruth said. $3. Drummond sipped his coffee. "Minus expenses, of course." Ruth's stomach dropped. "What expenses?" He pulled a small ledger from his vest pocket, flipped it open. "Let's see. Firewood, $1. Meals from the kitchen, $2. Use of tools and workspace, 50 cents. He looked up. "That leaves you owing me 50 cents? The world tilted. "You said $3 a week," Ruth managed. "I said $3 minus room and board," Drummond corrected. "You agreed." "I didn't agree to You took the work," he interrupted smoothly. "You used my shed, my tools, my firewood. You ate food from my kitchen." He closed the ledger. "I'm a fair man, Mrs. Calloway, but fair means accounting for costs." Ruth's hands curled into fists. "I earned that money." "And you spent it." He finished his coffee, set the cup on the porch rail. "Now, you've got a choice. You can keep working, I've got more saddles need mending, or you can settle your debt and leave." "What debt? You just said 50 cents this week, but there's also last week's balance. Food and lodger before you started working, that's another $17. Ruth couldn't breathe. $17, she had 40 cents to her name. Drummond watched her face. "Of course, if you can't pay, that's a legal matter. Sheriff Tate's just down in town. I'm sure he'd be happy to discuss arrangements." The shed door opened. Cal emerged with a burlap sack slung over his shoulder, set it on the porch with a heavy thud. More saddles. 20 this time, Drummond said. "By next Friday." Ruth stared at the sack, at Drummond's pleasant, patient face, at the ledger in his hand that turned her work into debt and her dignity into a transaction she couldn't afford. "I need to go to town," she said, voice barely steady. "Of course," Drummond smiled. "Take your time, but I'll need those saddles done. Contract's a contract." She turned and walked down the porch steps, legs stiff as winter wood. The Mercantile sat at the corner of Main Street and Church Road, its windows fogged with morning warmth. Ruth pushed through the door, bell jangling overhead, and stopped. Half the town was inside, Pastor Webb by the fabric bolts, Sheriff Tate near the counter, 3 ranch wives clustered by the canned goods. They all turned when she entered. Drummond came in behind her, loud, cheerful. "Mr. Garrett," he called to the shopkeeper, "I need to report a theft." The Mercantile went silent. Ruth's heart hammered. "What?" Drummond pulled a leather strap from his coat pocket. "Found this in Mrs. Calloway's shed. Cut from one of my saddles. Good leather. Worth about $2. "I didn't—" Ruth started. "Check her pockets," Drummond said calmly. Sheriff Tate stepped forward, face unhappy. "Ma'am, I need you to empty your coat." Ruth's hands shook as she turned out her pockets. The cabin key, a spool of thread, 40 cents in mixed coin, and a leather strap she'd never seen before. The room exhaled, a collective sound of judgment rendered. "I didn't take that," Ruth said, voice rising. "He put it there. He—" "Mrs. Calloway," Sheriff Tate said quietly. How much do you owe, Mr. Drummond? Her throat closed. I don't. $17.50, Drummond supplied. He pulled out his ledger, opened it for the sheriff. Been keeping a careful account. The sheriff looked at the ledger, at the leather strap, at Ruth's face. Ma'am, he said, you got $17? Ruth stared at the 40 cents in her palm. No. Then I'm afraid I got to ask you to come with me. She stole from me, Drummond said, voice dripping sympathy, but I'm willing to overlook it, if she pays what she owes. The ranch wives whispered. Pastor Webb looked at the floor. Ruth's vision blurred. The room pressed in, walls, face, the smell of coffee and judgment and cold February air every time the door opened. I can pay it, a voice said. Everyone turned. Doc Moss stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. He walked forward, pulled bills from his wallet, counted them out onto the counter. $18, he said, for whatever she owes, and I want a receipt. Drummond's smile thinned. Very charitable, Doctor. Not charity, Doc said. A loan, between friends. He looked at the sheriff. That settle it? Sheriff Tate glanced at Drummond, then nodded slowly. I suppose. Doc took the receipt, folded it carefully, and handed it to Ruth. His eyes held hers, steady, unyielding. Come on, he said quietly. Ruth followed him out into the street. The door closed behind them. Through the fogged window, she could see the shapes of people still watching. Her legs gave out halfway to Doc's wagon. She sank onto a hitching post, breath coming in short gasps. I didn't steal anything, she whispered. I know, Doc said. He set me up, in front of everyone. I know. Ruth looked down at her hands, raw, bleeding at the knuckles, trembling in her lap. 30 days, she said. And I still don't have proof. I don't have Ben's permit. I don't have anything. Doc crouched beside her. Your husband wasn't a fool, Ruth. Ben knew men like Drummond. He wouldn't have left you defenseless. He paused. Look harder. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow and horses and something else, wood smoke from the forge, distant and sharp. Ruth closed her eyes, tried to remember. Ben's hands, his voice, the way he used to carve his initials into things when he thought no one was watching. Hide it where they'll never look, right in front of him. Her eyes snapped open. The saddlebag, she breathed. Doc tilted his head. What? But Ruth was already standing, already moving, the blood rushing back into her legs like spring melt into frozen ground. I need to go, she said, and she ran. Ruth made it 3 steps before Doc caught her arm. Hold on, he said. Where are you going? The shed. I need... She pulled against his grip, but gently. Her breath came fast, white clouds in the cold air. Ben's saddlebag. I need to look at it, really look. Doc studied her face. Whatever he saw there made him nod. All right, but not yet. Doc, listen to me. His voice dropped low, meant only for her. Right now, half that mercantile is watching through the window. You run off looking desperate, Drummond's gonna know you're onto something. He'll have Cal or one of his boys tailing you before you're out of sight. Ruth's pulse hammered in her throat. Then what do I do? You walk to my wagon, slow, like a woman who just got embarrassed in public and needs a ride home. Doc's grip on her arm gentled, became an escort rather than a restraint. We'll figure the rest out where Drummond can't see. They climbed into the wagon, Ruth's legs shaking, hands gripping the seat edge to keep from bolting. Doc took up the reins and clicked his tongue. The horses started forward at an easy walk. Behind them, the mercantile door opened. Drummond stepped out onto the boardwalk, coffee cup in hand, watching them go. Doc didn't look back, just kept the horses steady, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting on the brake handle like a man with nowhere urgent to be. They turned the corner onto Church Road. The mercantile disappeared from view. Doc let out a slow breath. Now, he said, tell me about the saddlebag. The shed was exactly as Ruth had left it. Stove ticking softly, tools arranged on the bench, the new pile of saddles slumped in the corner like sleeping animals. And there, on the peg by the door, Ben's old saddlebag hung in shadow. Ruth crossed to it, lifted it down with both hands. The leather was worn soft from years of use, the color faded to the brown of old leaves. Ben's initials, B.C., were carved into the back panel, the lines still sharp despite time. She carried it to the workbench, set it down in the light from the window. Doc came to stand beside her, Gracie a silent presence at his elbow. The girl's eyes were fixed on the bag, wide and dark. What are we looking for? Doc asked. Ruth ran her fingers over the leather. Ben used to say he hid things in plain sight, things he didn't want lost or stolen. She traced the stitching along the edges, crosshatch pattern, tight and deliberate. I'd have thought he meant tools, his good knife, the silver buckle his father gave him. Her fingers paused, pressed against the front panel. But what if he meant something else? Doc leaned closer. You feel something? Ruth's hand moved slowly across the leather. There, just beneath the surface, a slight thickness, a place where the grain felt different. She pressed harder. It's doubled, she breathed. The leather's doubled here, 2 layers stitched together. Doc pulled his magnifying lens from his pocket, held it over the seam where the front panel met the back. Look at this stitching, he said. It's different from the rest. Tighter, newer. Ruth's heart kicked. Ben restitched this panel before he died. And put something inside, Doc finished. Gracie made a soft sound. Not quite a word, but close. She reached out, touched the spot where the brand was burned into the flap, then moved her hand to the thickened panel and pressed as if trying to feel what lay beneath. Ruth looked at Doc. I have to cut it open. You sure? Doc asked quietly. That's the last thing of his you got. Ruth stared at the bag, at Ben's initials, at the worn strap that had hung over his shoulder on 100 rides through the valley, through sun and snow in the long quiet of evening. He left it for me, she said. Whatever's inside, he meant for me to find it. Doc handed her a thin-bladed knife from the tool bench. Then let's see what Ben Calloway was hiding. Ruth positioned the blade at the seam where the doubled leather began. Her hand was steady now, certain. She pressed down. The leather parted with a whisper. 1 cut, 2, 3, following the line of the panel. Then she set down the knife and carefully peeled back the outer layer. Inside, folded tight and protected by oiled cloth, was a piece of paper. Ruth's breath caught. Doc leaned in. Is that... Ruth unfolded the cloth. The paper inside was yellow with age, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, an official seal, Montana Territory Land Office. Below it, careful script and a signature. Benjamin Calloway, April 1872, grazing permit Section 14, Township 3 North. And at the bottom, stitched directly into the paper with thread that matched the bag's lining, Ben's crosshatch pattern. Impossible to remove without destroying the document. Impossible to fake. Ruth's vision blurred. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. He knew, she whispered. He knew Drummond would come for it someday. Doc's hand came to rest on her shoulder. Ben was a smart man. Gracie pointed at something else, a second fold of cloth tucked deeper in the panel. Ruth reached in, pulled it out. Inside, a surveyor's map. The valley marked in careful detail, and at the edge of Ruth's property line, a notation in Ben's handwriting, railroad route. Drummond asked about it twice. Watch him. Doc exhaled slowly. He knew what Drummond was after. Ruth stared at the permit in her hands. Legal proof, physical proof. Ben's initials carved into the leather and stitched into the paper itself. But her hands were shaking now, not from fear, from something closer to rage. It's not enough, she said quietly. Doc frowned. What do you mean? That's the original. Drummond will say it's a forgery, that I made it, that I paid someone to fake the seal. Ruth's jaw tightened. I need more than paper. I need something he can't lie his way around. Doc was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the small notebook from his pocket, the one Gracie had drawn in days before, opened it to the page with the 2 brands sketched side by side. Ben's circled R, Drummond's circled D with horns. Gracie saw these brands together, Doc said slowly. On Drummond's ranch, which means he's using Ben's brand on his own cattle, Ruth finished, mixing the herds, so when the railroad assessors come through, it'll look like all the stock on that land is his. Doc nodded. That's fraud, cattle theft. If we can prove it. We can't, Ruth interrupted. Not without getting on his property. And he'll never let me near his ranch again, not after today. The 3 of them stood in silence. The permit lay on the workbench between them. Proof, but not enough. Never enough. Outside, the wind rattled the shed walls. Gracie tugged Doc's sleeve, pointed at the window. Through the glass, the sun was starting to sink. Late afternoon gold turning the snow pale orange. We've got time, Doc said quietly. Drummond thinks he's got you trapped, thinks you're broke and beaten. He looked at Ruth. Let him think it. Meanwhile, we build a case he can't buy his way out of. Ruth folded the permit carefully, wrapped it back in the oiled cloth. How? Town meetings in 2 weeks, Doc said. Drummond will be there. So will the territorial land agent. Comes through every spring to settle disputes. He paused. We make our stand there. Public, witnesses, everything out in the open. And if the agent sides with Drummond? Doc's face hardened. Then we make enough noise that Helena has to pay attention. Ruth slipped the wrapped permit into her coat pocket, felt its weight settle against her ribs. 2 weeks. 14 days to find proof that would stand up against money and lawyers and men who thought the law was whatever they said it was. She looked at Gracie. The girl's face was solemn, but her small hand reached out and squeezed Ruth's fingers. Outside, the last light of February bled across the snow. Inside the shed, 3 people made a plan in silence. The knock came at Doc's door 3 nights later, hard, insistent, the kind that said the person on the other side had already decided how the conversation would end. Doc set down his coffee and crossed the clinic to open it. Silas Drummond stood on the porch, Pastor Webb half a step behind him. Both men wore expressions of practiced concern. Evening, Doctor, Drummond said. Mind if we come in? Doc didn't move from the doorway. It's late. Won't take but a moment. Drummond's smile was thin. It's about Mrs. Calloway. Doc's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. The 2 men entered, bringing cold air and the smell of cigars and something else. Nervous sweat, barely masked by cologne. Pastor Webb wouldn't meet Doc's eyes. Coffee? Doc offered, voice flat. No, thank you. Drummond removed his hat, turned it in his hands. A gesture of false humility Doc had seen 100 times from men trying to sell you something you didn't want. I'll get right to it. I'm concerned about Mrs. Calloway's state of mind. Doc crossed his arms. That's so. I've been watching her these past weeks, the way she works herself to exhaustion, the wild accusations she's been making. Drummond shook his head sadly, claiming I forged documents, that I'm stealing from her, and now I hear she's been digging through her late husband's belongings, cutting apart his saddlebag. Doc's blood went cold. Cal must have been watching the shed. Grief does strange things to people, Pastor Webb added softly, especially women without family to care for them. Drummond set his hat on Doc's desk, pulled a folded document from his coat. I've spoken with Judge Harlan and Helena. He's authorized an assessment for Mrs. Calloway's protection, you understand. Doc took the document, read it slowly, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. Mental competency evaluation. Potential commitment to territorial asylum for treatment and care. You want to lock her up? Doc said flatly. I want to help her, Drummond corrected, before she hurts herself or makes accusations she can't take back. He paused. As the only physician in 50 miles, Doctor, you're the logical choice to sign the assessment papers. Doc set the document down. No. Drummond's smile didn't waver. I understand your hesitation, but consider, she's alone, clearly unstable, fixated on fantasies about stolen land. If something happens to her, well, I'd hate for you to carry that burden. She's not unstable, Doc said. She's right. The room went quiet. Pastor Webb shifted uncomfortably. Drummond's expression hardened, just for a moment, just enough to show the steel beneath the sympathy. Be very careful, Doctor, Drummond said softly. You're a respected man in this town, but respect only goes so far when you're harboring someone who's making slanderous claims. He picked up his hat. I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing. Sign the papers. Let her get the help she needs. Or what? Drummond adjusted his hat, met Doc's eyes. Or the town will start to wonder whose side you're really on, and whether a man who sides with thieves and lunatics is fit to tend their livestock, or their children. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Pastor Webb looked at the floor, said nothing. Drummond walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. 3 days, Doctor. Then I take this to Judge Harlan myself, and we'll see how Ruth Calloway fares in front of a territorial court without a friendly physician's testimony. He left. Pastor Webb followed, shoulders hunched, still not meeting Doc's gaze. The door closed. Doc stood alone in his clinic, the assessment papers on his desk, the smell of cigars and coercion thick in the air. Through the wall he heard a floorboard creak. Gracie's room. The girl had heard everything. Doc didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his desk with every scrap of paper he'd collected over the past 2 weeks spread before him. Territorial records, land office receipts, the forged permit, his own notes on the ink analysis. Somewhere in this mess was Drummond's weakness. Had to be. Men like Drummond built their power on foundations of lies, and lies, stacked high enough, always cracked. He picked up the forged permit again, studied the signature line, the witness signatures below it, witnessed by Samuel Court, acting deputy clerk, March 14, 1871. Doc frowned, pulled out the territorial registry book he'd borrowed from Helena, the one with all official appointments listed by year, ran his finger down the page. 1871, deputy clerks, Samuel Court. Appointed June 1871, not March. Doc's pulse quickened. He flipped back to the permit. March 14, 1871. Court couldn't have witnessed a document in March if he wasn't appointed until June. He grabbed another document, the one authorizing Drummond's brief tenure as acting territorial judge. Found the date? Appointed emergency judge, October 1872. Cholera crisis. Authority expired December 15, 1872. 6 weeks, just like Doc remembered. But Drummond's land office filings showed permits signed and notarized throughout 1873, with his judicial seal, after his authority had expired. Doc sat back, let the pieces fall into place. Drummond had used his brief judicial appointment to rubber stamp his own fraudulent claims, then kept using the seal after he had no legal right to it. Every document he'd filed for the past 3 years was void, not just Ruth's permit, all of them. Doc pulled out a map of the valley, started marking properties, every claim Drummond had filed since 1873, 15 parcels, 4 of them with families still living on the land thinking they'd lost it fair and square. Son of a bitch, Doc whispered. A soft footstep behind him. He turned. Ruth stood in the doorway, snow dusting her shawl. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but steady. I saw the light, she said. Figured you weren't sleeping either. Doc gestured to the papers. Come look at this. She crossed to the desk. He showed her the appointment dates, the witness signatures, the expired judicial seal. He's been forging documents for years, Doc said. Not just yours, everyone's. Every claim he's filed since '73 is fraudulent. Ruth stared at the papers. Her hand came up to her mouth. How many families? At least 10, maybe more. Doc pointed to the map. The Hendersons lost their place last spring, the Ortiz family before that. All of them filed claims that Drummond overrode with his fake judicial authority. Ruth's face went pale, then hard. We have to tell them. We will, Doc said. But we need to do it right, public, where Drummond can't threaten or bribe his way out. He looked at her. Town meeting's in 10 days. Territorial land agent will be there. We bring this, all of it, and we bring witnesses. He'll fight, Ruth said. Let him. Doc tapped the expired appointment notice. He's got money and fear on his side. But we've got the law, the real law. The kind that don't care how much a man's worth if he's a fraud. Ruth picked up the forged permit, studied it in the lamplight. Drummond told you to sign papers, commitment papers. Doc didn't ask how she knew. Small towns kept no secrets. I won't, he said simply. He'll come after you. He already is. Doc leaned back in his chair. But here's the thing about men like Drummond. They think power means making people afraid. They forget that sometimes fear runs out, and when it does, all you're left with is a bully who can't throw a real punch. Ruth set down the permit, met his eyes. You're risking everything. So are you, she smiled. Small, tired, but real. Then I guess we're both fools. Ben's kind of fools, Doc said. Outside, the wind picked up. The first thaw was coming. Doc could smell it in the air, that peculiar mix of mud and melting ice and something raw and alive stirring beneath the frozen ground. Spring was clawing its way north, and with it, a reckoning. Ruth pulled her shawl tight. 10 days. 10 days, Doc agreed. She turned to go, then paused at the door. Doc, thank you. He nodded, watched her disappear into the dark. Then he turned back to his desk and began writing a list of names. Every family Drummond had stolen from, every witness he'd need to bring the whole rotten structure down. The lamp burned low, the night stretched long, but Doc Moss didn't sleep. He had work to do. The shed was colder than it had any right to be. Ruth fed the last stick of firewood into the stove and watched the flames catch, orange light dancing across the rough plank walls. 3 days until the town meeting. 3 days to hold everything together. She sat on the crate by the workbench, Ben's saddlebag in her lap. The cut she'd made still showed, a clean line through leather that had survived 4 years of hard use. She'd destroyed it, the last whole thing of his. Her fingers traced the edges where she'd peeled back the layer, found the permit, the proof, but now the bag was just pieces, memory torn open and laid bare. Was it worth it? The question sat in her chest like a stone. Outside, the wind moaned through the eaves. Inside, the stove ticked and settled. Ruth closed her eyes. She could see Ben's hands, the way they'd moved when he worked leather, steady and sure, the way he'd carved his initials into things when he thought she wasn't watching. Fence posts, tool handles, the underside of their cabin's door frame. "Why do you do that?" she'd asked once. He'd smiled. "So folks know I was here, that I built something that mattered." Ruth opened her eyes, looked at the ruined saddlebag. He'd built more than fence posts, more than a cabin or a claim or any piece of ground. He'd built a life, their life, together, and Drummond thought he could erase that with forged ink and fake seals and money that smelled like other people's sweat. Ruth's hands stilled on the leather. "No." She stood, crossed to the workbench, pulled out her needle and thread. If Ben had stitched proof into this bag, then she could stitch it back together. Not the way it was, that was gone, but into something new, something that told the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored. She worked by lamplight, her fingers moving with the same careful precision she'd used on 100 saddles. But this time, every stitch was deliberate, every knot a promise. She stitched the permit directly into the front panel, visible through a window she'd cut in the leather, stitched the surveyor's map beside it, stitched Ben's initials around the border in her own crosshatch pattern, matching his exactly. When she was done, the saddlebag looked like what it was, a document, a testament, proof that couldn't be separated from the leather without destroying both. The shed door creaked. Ruth's hand went to the knife on the bench. "It's me," Gracie's small voice said. Ruth exhaled, set down the knife. "Gracie, what are you doing out here? It's past midnight." The girl stepped into the lamplight. She wore her nightdress under a too-big coat, Doc's, probably, and her feet were bare in unlaced boots. She crossed to the workbench, stared at the reconstructed saddlebag, then she reached out, touched the stitching Ruth had just finished. Her small fingers traced the lines carefully, reverently, and she smiled. Ruth's throat tightened. "You like it?" Gracie nodded. Then she did something Ruth had never seen her do. She picked up the pencil from the workbench, found a scrap of paper, drew quickly, with the fierce concentration of a child who has something important to say and no words to say it. When she finished, she held it up. The drawing showed two brands side by side. Ben's circled R and Drummond's circled D, but this time Gracie had drawn something else beneath them. A cow, with both brands on its hide. Ruth stared. "You saw this, on Drummond's ranch." Gracie nodded. "When?" The girl's hand moved across the paper, drew a small figure, herself, peeking around the corner of a barn, drew a man with a branding iron, drew smoke rising. Ruth's pulse hammered. He rebranded Ben's cattle, put his mark over the top. Gracie nodded again, pointed to the date she'd written at the bottom of the page. Last summer, after Ben died, after Ruth had been too grief-stricken to check the herd, Drummond had simply walked onto her land, rounded up her cattle, and burned his brand into them. Theft, plain and simple. Ruth knelt down, eye level with Gracie. "Can you show people this? At the town meeting?" Gracie's face went pale. She shook her head, sharp, frightened. "I know you're scared," Ruth said softly. "But this is important. This is how we prove what he did." The girl backed away. Her hands came up, palms out, warding off the question. Ruth's heart broke. Okay, honey. You don't have to." But Gracie was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. She pointed at her throat, shook her head, pointed at Ruth, then at the saddlebag, then at herself. Ruth didn't understand. Then Gracie picked up the pencil again, wrote one word in large, shaky letters. "Scared." "Of Drummond?" Ruth asked. Gracie shook her head, pointed at her own throat again, wrote another word. "Broke." Ruth pulled the girl into her arms, held her while she shook. "Your voice isn't broke, sweetheart. It's just sleeping, waiting for the right time." Gracie pulled back, looked at Ruth with eyes too old for 8 years, picked up the pencil one more time. "What if it never wakes up?" Ruth cupped the girl's face in her work-rough hands. "Then you'll find other ways to speak, like this drawing, like the way you touched that saddlebag and showed me the truth." She smoothed Gracie's hair. "There's more than one kind of voice, honey. And yours is plenty loud. I hear you just fine. Gracie's tears slowed. She leaned against Ruth's shoulder, small and warm and trusting. Outside, the wind shifted. The smell of mud and thaw crept through the cracks in the walls. Spring was coming, and with it, the hardest fight Ruth Calloway had ever faced. Morning came gray and cold. Ruth woke in the shed. She'd fallen asleep at the workbench. Gracie curled up on a pile of horse blankets in the corner. Doc arrived with breakfast and a grim expression. "Drummond knows," he said without preamble. Ruth sat up, neck stiff. "Knows what?" "That we found something. Cal saw you cutting open the saddlebag," reported back. Doc set down the bundle of food, bread and dried meat, still warm. "Drummond's been asking questions, wants to know what was inside." Ruth pulled the reconstructed saddlebag from beneath the workbench, showed Doc what she'd done, the permit stitched into the leather, visible through the window she'd cut. Doc let out a low whistle. That's perfect. Can't claim it's a fake when it's literally part of the bag." "That's what I figured," Ruth said. "But it also means we can't wait for the town meeting," Doc continued. "Drummond will try something before then. Steal it, destroy it, discredit you before you can show anyone. So what do we do?" Doc was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his pocket watch, checked the time. "Church is in 3 hours," he said. "Whole town will be there, including the territorial land agent. He came in early for some reason, staying at the hotel." Ruth's eyes widened. "You want to do this today?" "I want to do it now, before Drummond has time to prepare." Doc looked at her. "You ready?" Ruth looked at the saddlebag in her hands, at Gracie just waking up in the corner, at the thin morning light coming through the shed window, 3 days early. No time to prepare, no time to rehearse what she'd say or how she'd say it, just the truth stitched into leather, in a town full of people who might finally be ready to see it. "I'm ready," she said. Doc nodded, helped Gracie to her feet. "Then let's go ring a bell." Outside, the first rain of March began to fall, cold and clean, washing the snow into mud, turning the roads into rivers of thaw. Ruth stepped out of the shed for the last time as a woman with something to hide. When she came back, if she came back, it would be as something else entirely. She didn't know what yet, but she could feel it coming, like thunder before lightning, like spring breaking through frozen ground. The bell rang at noon, not the usual Sunday call, but 3 hard, deliberate peals that echoed across the valley like a judge's gavel. People stopped mid-task, looked up from Sunday dinners half-eaten, from wagons half-loaded, from conversations half-finished. 3 bells meant one thing, truth-telling. The old tradition, rarely used. When someone rang the bell that way, the town gathered, and whoever had rung it stood on the church steps and spoke their piece, witnessed by God and neighbors alike. You didn't lie during a truth-telling, not if you wanted to keep living in the valley. Ruth stood at the base of the church steps, the reconstructed saddlebag in her hands. Doc stood beside her, Gracie pressed close to his leg. Around them, townsfolk gathered in 2s and 3s, curious, wary, some already shaking their heads. Sheriff Tate arrived, hand resting on his gun belt. "Who rang that bell?" "I did," Doc said calmly. "On whose authority?" "Mine and hers." Doc nodded toward Ruth. "She's got something to say, and you're all going to listen." A wagon rolled up, Drummond's. Cal drove, but Drummond himself sat in the back, flanked by 2 ranch hands. He climbed down slowly, brushed mud from his coat, and surveyed the growing crowd with the expression of a man interrupted from more important business. "This is highly irregular, Doctor," he said. "Sunday morning, people at their rest." "Truth don't keep a schedule," Doc replied. Drummond's eyes found Ruth, traveled to the saddlebag in her hands. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, cold and quick. "Mrs. Calloway," he said pleasantly, "I wasn't aware you had anything of interest to share." Ruth climbed the first step. Her legs shook, but her hands stayed steady. "I have proof," she said. Her voice carried, not loud but clear. "Proof that my husband filed claim to our land in 1872. Proof that you forged documents to steal it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Drummond smiled. "Strong words, he said. "I hope you can back them up." "I can." A new voice cut through the crowd. A man Ruth had never seen, lean, weathered in a black coat with a territorial badge pinned to his chest, pushed through to the front. "I'm Agent Nathaniel Cross," he said. "Territorial Land Office. I'll hear this testimony." Drummond's smile thinned. "Agent Cross? I wasn't expecting you until Tuesday." Plans changed. Cross climbed the steps, stood beside Ruth. "Proceed, ma'am." Ruth took a breath. The smell of wet wool and mud and cold stone filled her lungs. She held up the saddlebag, showed the crowd the window she'd cut, the permit visible beneath. "This is my husband's original grazing permit, filed April 1872, witnessed by Thomas Healy, territorial surveyor." She traced the stitching around the edge. "Ben stitched it into this saddlebag before he died, hid it where no one would think to look, because he knew someone would try to take it." Agent Cross took the bag, examined it closely, pulled out a lens, studied the permit's seal. "This appears authentic," he said. "It's a forgery," Drummond said smoothly. "Made recently, stitched into old leather to make it look genuine." "No," Doc said. He stepped forward, pulled out his notes. "The stitching pattern matches the bag's original construction. Same thread, same technique. And the permit itself uses iron gall ink, the kind available in 72 during the territorial shortage. Your permit, Mr. Drummond, uses aniline ink, the kind that didn't become common until 74. The crowd murmured louder now. Agent Cross looked at Drummond. "May I see your documentation, Mr. Drummond?" Drummond pulled the folded permit from his coat, handed it over with perfect confidence. Cross examined it, frowned. "This is dated March 1871. "Correct," Drummond said. "And witnessed by Samuel Court, deputy clerk." "Yes." Cross looked up. Mr. Cross looked. Court wasn't appointed until June of that year. He couldn't have witnessed a document in March. The murmur became a rumble. Drummond's jaw tightened. "Clerical error," he said. "The date was likely transcribed wrong." "That's convenient," Doc said. He pulled out another document. "Here's your appointment as territorial judge. October 1872. Authority expired December 72, but you filed permits under that seal throughout 1873 and 74. Cross took the document. His expression hardened. "After your authority expired?" "I assumed." "The law don't care what you assumed," Sheriff Tate interrupted. His hand moved away from his gun. "This is starting to sound like fraud, Drummond." "It's a misunderstanding," Drummond said, voice rising. "This woman is unstable. She's been harassing me for weeks, making wild accusations." "Then explain this," Ruth said. She reached into her coat, pulled out Gracie's drawing, the two brands side by side, the cow marked with both. "Your brand, and my husband's, on the same cattle." Drummond barely glanced at it. "A child's drawing, hardly evidence." "Gracie saw you," Ruth pressed. "Last summer, after Ben died. You rounded up my cattle and rebranded them." "Prove it," Drummond said flatly. Silence fell over the church steps. Ruth looked at Gracie. The girl's face was white, pressed against Doc's leg, her eyes huge and terrified. "I can't prove it," Ruth said quietly. "Not unless someone speaks up." Drummond relaxed. "Then we're done here." "Not quite," Agent Cross said. He turned to the crowd. "Anyone here seen evidence of cattle theft? Rebranding?" No one moved. No one spoke. Ruth's heart sank. Then, a sound, small, barely audible. A hum. Everyone turned. Gracie stood apart from Doc now. Her mouth was open. The sound coming from her throat was thin and fragile, like something long buried finally clawing toward light. Doc knelt beside her. "Gracie?" The humming stopped. The girl's lips moved. Once, twice. "I saw..." The words were barely whispers, broken, rusted with disuse, but they were words. The crowd held its breath. "I saw him," Gracie said, louder now. She pointed at Drummond with a shaking hand. "In the barn. He had the iron. Ben's cows. He burned them." Drummond's face went dark. "This is absurd. The child hasn't spoken in months. She's been coached." "I'm 8, Gracie said, tears streaming down her face. "Not stupid." A laugh rippled through the crowd, short, surprised. Agent Cross crouched in front of Gracie. "You saw Mr. Drummond rebrand cattle that belonged to Mrs. Calloway's husband?" Gracie nodded. "Last July. He didn't see me. I was hiding." "Where?" "Hayloft. I was looking for kittens." Her voice grew stronger with each word, like muscle remembering how to work. "He told Cal to do the ones by the creek, too. Said no one would check." Sheriff Tate turned to Drummond. "You want to answer that?" "She's lying," Drummond snapped. "Or confused, or telling the truth," Doc said, "which you can't buy your way around." Agent Cross stood, looked at Drummond, at Ruth, at the permit still in his hands. "Mr. Drummond," he said formally, "based on testimonial and documentary evidence, I'm suspending your land claim pending full territorial investigation. Sheriff, I'll need you to impound any documents in Mr. Drummond's possession related to property filings since 1872. "No," Drummond said. "You can't." "I can," Cross said. "And I am." Drummond lunged, not at Cross, but at Ruth, hands reaching for the saddlebag, face twisted with rage. "That's mine." Doc and Sheriff Tate caught him, pulled him back. He thrashed, coat tearing, hat falling into the mud. "You think this is over?" Drummond snarled at Ruth. "You think you've won? I'll bury you. "You're done, Silas," Sheriff Tate said quietly. Pulled out handcuffs. "For fraud, for theft, for assault if you keep going." The metal clicked around Drummond's wrists. The crowd watched in silence. And then, from the church tower above, the bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound rolled across the valley, clear and strong and final. Truth had been spoken and witnessed. Ruth stood on the church steps, saddlebag in her hands, Gracie pressed against her side. The girl was still crying, but she was smiling too. "Mama Ruth," she whispered. And Ruth Calloway, widow, leather worker, woman who'd stitched truth into leather when lies tried to bury her, wrapped her arms around the child and held on. Above them, the bell kept ringing. Below them, the mud season had come. And with it, spring. The territorial marshal arrived from Helena 4 days later, a hard-eyed man named Garrett who looked like he'd spent 30 years deciding which lies to believe and which to bury. He set up in the church vestibule, called witnesses one by one. Ruth went first, carrying the saddlebag like a shield. Agent Cross testified second, Sheriff Tate third. Then came the families, Henderson, Ortiz, McKay, people Ruth barely knew, all holding documents Drummond had signed with a seal he'd had no right to use. 10 families, 15 fraudulent claims, 20 years of combined loss. When the marshal finished taking statements, he stood on the church steps and read the charges in a voice that carried to the back of the crowd. Fraud, forgery, cattle theft, abuse of judicial authority, attempted intimidation of witnesses. Drummond sat in the front pew, wrists still cuffed, flanked by deputies. His face was stone, but his eyes, when they found Ruth, burned with something cold and venomous. "Mr. Drummond," Marshal Garrett said, "you're remanded to territorial custody pending trial. Sentencing will be in Helena under Judge Morrison. Anything to say?" Drummond stood slowly, looked at Ruth, at Doc, at Gracie, still pressed close to Ruth's side. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. Not a threat, a promise. "Take him," the marshal said. 2 deputies hauled Drummond toward the door. As he passed Ruth, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he whispered. "I've got friends you'll never see coming." Then he was gone, boots echoing on stone, the church door slamming behind him. Ruth exhaled, a breath she'd been holding for weeks, maybe months. Her knees went weak. Doc caught her elbow. "It's done," he said. "Is it?" Ruth asked. She could still feel Drummond's eyes on her, still hear the certainty in his voice. Marshal Garrett approached, tucking papers into a leather case. "Mrs. Calloway, your land claim is reinstated as of today. Drummond's permits are void. You'll get formal notice from Helena within the week." Ruth nodded, throat too tight to speak. The marshal glanced at the other families clustered in the pews. "Rest of you, too. We'll sort the ownership records, but far as the territory's concerned, you're back on your land, legal and clear." A murmur went through the room. Relief, disbelief, something too fragile to name. "What about restitution?" Henderson asked. "He took 3 years of our cattle." "That'll be handled at trial," the marshal said. "But I wouldn't hold my breath. Men like Drummond usually got more debts than assets by the time we catch 'em." He tipped his hat to Ruth and left. The families filed out slowly. Some touched Ruth's shoulder as they passed. Others just nodded, silent acknowledgement that they'd all been fighting the same fight without knowing it. When the church emptied, only Ruth, Doc, and Gracie remained. "You did it," Doc said. Ruth looked at the saddlebag in her lap, at the stitching she'd torn apart and rebuilt, at Ben's initials still visible through the window she'd cut. "We did it," she corrected. Gracie tugged her sleeve, pointed toward the door. Outside, the mud was ankle-deep, but beyond it, the creek ran fast and loud with snowmelt. And on the hills, the first green was starting to show, pale and tentative but real, spring finally breaking through. 2 weeks later, the valley woke to birdsong. Ruth heard it from the workshop, Her workshop now, the one she'd moved from Drummond's shed to a small building behind Doc's clinic. The rent was fair, the stove worked. And every morning, Gracie appeared with coffee and sat in the corner stitching leather while Ruth worked. The girl's voice was still quiet, still hesitant, but it was there, growing stronger each day, like new muscle remembering its purpose. This morning, she was humming while she stitched, something formless and gentle that matched the rhythm of the meadowlarks outside. Ruth finished the bridle she'd been mending and hung it on the peg, stepped to the door. The creek had thawed completely now, water running clear over stones that had been buried since November. The boundary stakes Doc had found were visible again, weathered wood with faint rope marks, cross-hatched and unmistakable. Ben's work, still standing, a wagon rolled up the road. Ruth shaded her eyes. Sheriff Tate climbed down, holding a wooden crate. "Morning, Mrs. Calloway?" "Sheriff." He carried the crate to the workshop door, set it down carefully. "Marshall sent this from Helena, said it was impounded from Drummond's ranch, thought you might want it back." Ruth knelt beside the crate, lifted the lid. Inside, tools, Ben's tools, the ones that had disappeared after he died. His good knife, the awl with the carved handle, the leather punch he'd made from a bullet casing. And beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, a packet of letters, Ben's handwriting on the envelopes, addressed to her, never sent. Ruth's hands trembled as she lifted them out. "Drummond had these?" she asked. "Looks like he cleaned out your cabin while you were working yourself to death in his shed," Tate said. His jaw tightened. "Took anything that might have been useful as proof, or just to hurt you." Ruth clutched the letters to her chest. "Thank you, Sheriff." Tate touched his hat brim. "You need anything, you let me know. Town owes you." He left. Ruth carried the letters inside, sat at her workbench, and broke the seal on the first one. "Ruth, if you're reading this, I'm likely gone. Sounds morbid, I know, but a man gets to thinking, out here, about what matters, what lasts. I filed the claim under both our names, but if something happens, Drummond's gonna come for it. He asked me twice about selling. Offered good money. When I said no, he got that look men get when they're deciding whether to be patient or not. So I'm hiding the proof. In the saddlebag, the one with my initials. You'll know where to look. Don't trust the law, Ruth. Trust your hands. Trust the work. That's the only thing that don't lie. All my love." Ruth read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, next to her heart. Outside, the tin roof pattered with soft rain. Inside, Gracie hummed and stitched. And above the workshop door, hung with ceremony the day Ruth moved in, Ben's saddlebag rested. Empty now, but honored. The permit had been filed with the territorial office. The proof was recorded, but the bag remained, a reminder. That truth could be stitched into leather. That family wasn't always blood. That dignity couldn't be bought or stolen, only defended, stitch by careful stitch. The door opened. Doc stepped in, shaking rain from his coat. "Got a commission for you," he said. "Town wants a memorial saddle. For the church, in honor of everyone who stood up to Drummond." Ruth smiled. "What kind of saddle?" "One with crosshatch stitching," Doc said. "The kind that can't be faked." "I can do that." Gracie looked up from her work. "Can I help?" Ruth's throat tightened. She reached out, smoothed the girl's dark hair. "Always," she said. The 3 of them worked in companionable silence, leather and thread, rain and bird song, the smell of neat's foot oil and warm earth and coffee growing cold in chipped mugs. Outside, the valley stretched green and wide. Inside, Ruth Calloway, leatherworker, landowner, mother by choice, kept stitching, the way Ben taught her, the way she'd teach Gracie, the way truth got passed down, one careful knot at a time. The meadowlarks returned that April, same week the aspens leafed out along the creek. Ruth heard them while oiling a new bridle, Gracie humming beside her, needle flashing in soft morning light. Doc stopped by with coffee, same as he had every Monday since January, sat on the porch rail without speaking. That was fine. Some things didn't need words. The town had changed. Or maybe Ruth just saw it clearer now. Folks nodded when she passed. Sheriff tipped his hat. Even Pastor Webb, shamed but still standing, brought his torn Bible cover for mending. She charged him full price. He paid without complaint. Drummond was gone. Territorial prison, 15 years for fraud. His ranch sold at auction. Ruth didn't bid. Some land wasn't worth the cost of holding. The memorial saddle hung in the church vestibule now, crosshatch pattern gleaming in candlelight. Folks touched it before services the way they might touch a saint's relic. Ruth didn't mind. Let them remember that a person's work outlasts their body. if they stitch it true. Gracie tugged her sleeve, pointed at a torn stirrup strap. Ruth smiled, handed her the needle. Your turn, honey. Remember, leather don't lie. Shows every hand that touched it. The girl bent close, tongue between her teeth, working the thread with fierce concentration. Ruth watched, throat tight. Family wasn't blood. It was who stayed when winter came, who handed you the knife when you were too afraid to cut, who learned your stitches and carried them forward. Spring rain started again, soft patter on the tin roof. Ruth closed her eyes, listening. Somewhere out there, another woman was stitching in the cold, fingers bleeding, wondering if skill alone could save her. Ruth hoped she'd remember. Truth hides in plain sight, and the law bends, eventually, when enough folks decide to look. The meadowlarks sang, Gracie hummed, the leather waited, honest as dirt, and Ruth Calloway, widow, leather worker, mother by choice, kept stitching.